We just learned how to represent more complex data in JavaScript using objects. For instance, we learned how to represent something like a car using a JavaScript object. However, what happens if we want to represent multiple cars? What if we have 3 cars that we want to represent? Well, with our current understanding of JavaScript, we'd probably do something like this. We'd probably create 3 distinct variables, all containing a car. And they'd likely have the same properties and things like that. And this works if we know the number of cars that we need to represent before writing our program. But in reality, most cases will have an arbitrary number of cars. That meaning we won't know exactly how many cars we need to store beforehand because it may be dependent on a user adding cars to a list through a form on our web page. So we need a new type of data type that allows us to represent and add and remove an arbitrary number of objects or even primitive data types. And that brings us to our discussion about arrays. Arrays are another type of composite data type in JavaScript that essentially act as a list. They store an arbitrary number of variables which we can add and remove to as we please. And an array in JavaScript looks like this. Now the syntax of an array is rather quite simple. We begin the array with an opening bracket and we close the array with a closing bracket. Then within the array we have a comma-separated list of the elements that we want stored in our array. And let's go ahead and print this array to the console to see how it looks when we render it in our browser. And we see that it prints to the console as this bracket and closed comma-separated list. But when we expand this out, it says that it's an array of size 3, and then it shows each object within the array according to its index. Remember earlier in this lesson, we talked about how in JavaScript indices start at 0, and here we can see that explicitly. The element at index 0 is our first element, and that's the one that corresponds to the Aston Martin DB7. Then our second element is at index 1, and our third element is at index 2. So again, bear in mind the 0 indexing that takes place in JavaScript. But that's pretty cool because now we can see how this comma-separated list makes our array elements essentially anonymous so that we don't actually have to distinguish between them with unique variables. Instead, we can just store them all in this array. And we'll take a look in the next section about how to manipulate our array, how to add elements and how to remove elements from it. But for now, let's take a look at how to actually access these individual elements within our array. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to use a simpler array. This array I have here, it's still of size 3, but it has primitive data types rather than objects, so we can more clearly see what we're doing. And take note as well that an array doesn't have to store all the same type of data. For instance, here I have 3 different types of data, right? I have a number, a Boolean, and a string. And what I'm going to demonstrate is how to access these data, these elements from our array to both retrieve them and to mutate them. In order to access an element within our array, we simply type the name of the array followed by an opening and closing bracket containing the index of the element that we want to access. Here we can see that I've accessed the element in index 0, so it should return the first element in our array, this value of 1, when I log it to the console. Now, a question you may have is what happens if we try and access an element via an index that is beyond the indices of values or indices of elements within our array. For instance, in this case, my array is of size 3, so if I try and access an element at index 3, it shouldn't grab anything, but what exactly does it do? Well, to find out, let's go to our browser and evaluate the console to see what it prints when we try and access an array at an element that is outside the scope of our array. And we can see that just as we'd expect in the first example, when we select the element at index 0, it returns that value of 1 that we were anticipating. But when we try and access an element that's outside of the range of our array, it prints undefined. To mutate elements in our array, we do a similar thing as we did here, where we access the element in our array first, and then we simply assign a new value to that element. So it's much like when we assign a new value to any other variable, but in this case we simply have to include the brackets containing the index of the element in our array that we want to assign a new value to, that we want to mutate. So here we'll print it out again to the console and see what happens when we do. And we see that the element in index 0 is properly changed from 1 to 2. So that's basic array retrieval and mutation. In the next section, we're going to look at some more complex things we can do with arrays that may be necessary in some of the programs we decide to write.